Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Sorry, I had a little mishap with the technology here. My name is Josh Anderson. I am the founder of the Retirement Innovation Lab. We are an independent firm focused at providing research, thought leadership, consulting to different stakeholders in the retirement plan space. Um, we were started in January of this year in order to serve the multiple stakeholders across the advisory community. And so today we're going to be covering what I think is a huge gap in the general knowledge of retirement plan advisors, um, and something that I think is really just lacking in the proper education across the board. And so the goal of the paper that was put out was to provide a overview to advisors, to their home offices, to plan sponsors to better understand managed accounts. It's something that we're seeing, really take off and grow year over year. But from my experience, there's still a pretty large gap in the education level and just basic understanding. So the goal of this is to provide an overview and to allow you to take it further on your own to dive into the different nuances. And we'll talk about some of those, but to dive into that and really set you up so that you can then perform your own due diligence and be properly prepared for at least the basics. So with that, we'll dive into the presentation. And all right. So I mentioned I'm Josh Anderson. A little bit about my background. So I spent the first part of my career, about 7 years at Fidelity in different roles, from working the Green Line, literally the 800 Fidelity line out of college, to moving over to the DCIO channel. And then eventually that led me to Raymond James when they were building out their fiduciary services group. I went over there, was part of the team that built out their 338 program, and then onboarded that with the different partners, the different record keepers, and played point on that, as well as the relationship management going forward. Then after that, I went to Franklin Templeton, where I sat within the distribution organization, but was focused on managed accounts. And that's really kind of the time at Raymond James. I was doing due diligence on managed accounts and then moving over to Franklin. This has been something that's near and dear to my heart, something that I am passionate about, for a number of years. And at Franklin, we built out, essentially like an innovation lab in which we were, driving the best ideas forward around managed accounts, retirement income, in plan annuities, AI in the workplace for some of these at work programs. And so looking to continue a lot of that with, my current firm here. So diving in, we're going to cover, kind of an overview, the structure, key terms. We'll touch on some fiduciary considerations. We're planning a follow-up webinar with an ERISA attorney that will really dive into that in the future. And then we'll touch on some of the research, both for and against managed accounts or personalized target dates, specifically around participant income. Um, but before we dive into all of that, I think it's important to kind of set the stage of why personalization makes sense inside of a retirement plan. And if you think about just the progression of retirement plans over the last 30 or 40 years, we had DB plans, we had pensions, and the good thing about that was it allowed participants to show up to work, do their job, and then when they went to retire, they pretty much could keep the same, quality of life. With the introduction of defined contribution plans, 401ks, that dynamic really was flipped, where participants now were the ones who had to be knowledgeable on how much to save, what to invest it in, all the things that you as experts in financial planning, as advisors, come second nature. But to the average person, they're really kind of left, to their own devices, to different, maybe self-service things. And honestly, a lot of the financial wellness programs I've seen are, essentially glorified YouTube channels. They might use AI to say, hey, here's a video that's relevant to you, but it really isn't specific to their situation, isn't factoring in that individual's unique needs or goals. And there's a study that I quote in the paper, but essentially, about half of Americans are unprepared to make or uncomfortable with making financial decisions. And so they're looking to us in the industry to provide them with that guidance and with the tools that they need to be successful. Now, within Harissa, there's some additional concerns that we need to be taking into account. But I think there's certainly, a need right now in particular for participants to have education, to understand where they are along their journey, and then to be able to take action in a easy way in order to achieve their goals. So we'll just dive in. So into kind of the overview and the background. And this is a timeline I put together, and some may disagree with some of the inflection dates, but this is I think a pretty good summarization of the last handful or so years. So like pre 2018, let's call it, a lot of the solutions out there were proprietary solutions by a record keeper. I worked at Fidelity. I sold Pass back when they were trying to get that into the workplace. I've sold, other managed accounts as well. And I think, just prior to that point, you saw lack of flexibility, a lot of proprietary investments, lack of branding or flexibility. And many times there were some restrictions on what funds could or could not be used within the product. And then 2018 or so, let's call it 2018 to 2020, this kind of took form or took shape. And in my opinion, it was really driven by Morningstar. They had tremendous success driving forward the concept of advisor managed accounts, which then allowed the advisor to actually provide customization and have a solution that aligned with their firm's values, their branding, perhaps their own firm models, and really kind of ushered in, what I would call a new era of managed accounts, where you start to see all these new entrants coming in, trying to iterate off of that expanded personalization. And with that advisor interest now, that really drove record keeper adoption. I mean, you go back to 2018, even 2019, there wasn't a ton of record keepers who had AMAs or really anything that you could brand or customize, to the extent that we see now, where nearly everyone has it, and those that don't have it are scrambling to add new services. Or in many instances over the last year, we've seen record keepers roll out new services and trying to enhance what they're offering. And that's kind of what I see in 2021 to 2023 with these new solutions. You see record keepers really starting to take action, especially now that they're getting on the tail end of the Secure Act issues. And so with that, um, that has led to greater competition and therefore price compression in these products. Historically, they just were too expensive for a fiduciary to justify using in a plan, in my opinion, especially when you look at them relative to target dates. But what we've seen is that cost has really, really been driven down to the point where many solutions in the market are at the same cost or cheaper, all into a participant, relative to, say, a active target date, and in many cases, even some of the blend hybrid target dates. Now, index, that's a kind of a different thing. I'd argue it's a different participant that you're going after with the two, but you certainly see price compression, which makes it more, I think, justifiable to use as a QDIA. And then, let's say today and beyond, where we're seeing the enhancements, the money being spent, it's really to drive participant engagement. I'll talk about that in the kind of research section towards the end, but participant engagement is key with these solutions. Enhanced solutions, really trying to bring in additional outside assets, getting a more holistic view of a participant. Retirement income, that's where we're seeing the in-plan annuities coming out. Not that they've taken, really much hold today, but we're starting to see the initial movement there. And I think managed accounts, anything that's personalized is really, probably the most prudent way to be delivering those system or those solutions to participants. The other thing we're starting to see take off is this concept of non-core investments, and we'll talk about that in a minute with the key terms. But non-core is essentially when you're using other funds besides what's in the fund menu that's available to participants in order to build the managed account. Now, there's pros and cons to this, certainly. But where we're starting to see interest in this is to deliver unique investments such as retirement income that I just mentioned, but also things like alternatives in DC plans, which is in its infancy, but could be delivered in that method. You could also use perhaps asset classes you don't want to give exposure to or give access to just the general participant base, but maybe you feel that there is value in having certain asset classes within your allocations. And then the other area we see is the use of AI. And so there's a number of solutions. One that I think is pretty interesting is Athena Advisory down in Austin, Texas, was founded by some former Morningstar folks. And what they're doing is just a holistic view of a participant where you look at the debt, you look at their insurance, their assets, and be able to provide them with a kind of conversational experience, but a holistic view of their situations. I think those solutions are going to, probably continue to enhance, and I'd imagine, continue to see growth. And I also anticipate further price compression over the next few years. So let's just touch on some key terms so that we are all on the same page. So the first one here is the user interface. This is, essentially what you're interacting with, what you see on your computer screen, what you're entering information in, and how information from the back-end systems are brought forward to be displayed to the participant. This is, essentially if you've signed on to a record keeper participant website, you're seeing the UI that then plugs into their record keeping system. And so this is a similar kind of concept. It's the user interface that participants use to see, interact, and kind of make changes. The advice engine is the piece that is usually proprietary to a managed account provider. There's multiple out there. Morningstar has their own, Stadion, iJoin has their own. There's a number of solutions out there, and the advice engine is what takes all the unique inputs, the participant demographic data, any participant provided inputs, and then comes up with the target allocation, and then takes that target allocation and blends the available funds that in order to create that individual's unique portfolio. And then the advice engine uses a combination of the strategic asset allocation and the available funds, which we'll cover on the next slide, in order to come up with those. And so the SAAs are, think of them as firm models. These are the asset class level portfolios that represent the available universe for the advice engine to choose. Usually, the most conservative and the most aggressive strategic asset allocations are the kind of max and minimum portfolio that's available, because we're typically not using leverage inside of retirement plans. Fiduciary role. This one's I think very important to understand, like what role the provider is playing. Typically, they're going to be 338 to the participant, but sometimes it could be non-discretionary. So they may only be providing one-time advice, and so it's important to understand what role that provider is playing, so that you can make sure that the pricing is appropriate, and make sure that they are actually, in fact, fulfilling those roles as you are overseeing and monitoring them. Portfolio blending methodology. That's how the advice engine is taking the strategic asset allocations and blending them to get to the final portfolio. There's two main kind of categories. I break this down to discrete portfolios and blended portfolios. Discrete portfolios is when the engine will say, let's say there's 16 strategic asset allocations available. They sit along the efficient frontier. A discrete methodology will put them in a single portfolio. So portfolio one, portfolio two, portfolio eight, whatever it might be. A a blending methodology will actually take different portfolios and then blend them together in multiple different ways. So like Morningstar uses the blending approach. They typically have, three accumulation, three decumulation portfolios, and then they'll blend those together to come up with hundreds and hundreds of different options. So just two different options, and it's important to understand the methodology around that. Core versus non-core, I touched on this earlier, but essentially core is when you use the funds that are available to participants, the DIAs, in order to build the managed account portfolios. And then the non-core is when you have funds that are not available to participants that make up these. They're essentially walled off from access from participants. Input factors, that's going to refer to the different inputs, the different unique things from a participant, things like their sex, their location, income, risk tolerance, goals, um, outside assets, spousal assets, things like that that can be used as a factor in the advice provided. Outside accounts, these are, exactly what they sound like. It's accounts outside of the 401k, other IRAs, maybe annuities, an old pension, old 401k, things like that that are relevant to the advice that's giving. And then middleware. This is a term that's thrown around and means a lot of things. You'll hear it used within the insurance world, but for our context, middleware is the firm, usually a technology provider, that provides that bridge from the record keeper to the advice engine. And most of the time, you'll see the advice engine and the UI and the middleware all provided by the same provider. So like Morningstar, they're providing the UI, the middleware piece, they plug directly into the record keeper, and then they're providing the advice engine as well. Others take Leaf House or Franklin Templeton, for instance. They have a middleware that they've partnered with called iJoin, and so iJoin has the plugins to the record keeper. They have their own user interface, and in the case of Franklin Templeton, it's a Franklin Templeton advice engine, and so there can be different players within that, and so just understanding who is involved, what role are they playing, and what are they all getting paid to provide those services are key to evaluating the value versus is cost that you receive. So let's move on to the structure and what can be customized. I think the challenge, honestly, putting this together is there's significant variation amongst the providers, and they do things a little bit differently. So this isn't meant to be specific to anyone or even a kind of consistent rule, but there's always usually four main components that need to be brought in. And now some of them will work different, some of them will look different between advisors. But the four main areas are the user interface. You have to see, you have to interact in some way. The advice engine, right? You need to get the advice and turn it into actionable steps, the strategic asset allocation, and then the investments that are usually built. So the core or non-core from the prior slide. And all of those work together. We'll see a slide that kind of summarizes how everything works and the flow. Now, historically, like customization was very limited, as I mentioned at beginning, and But what we've seen is just huge advancements in the ability to customize. And so now it's very common to be able to do your firm branding. Strategic asset allocations are usually always a thing at this point. And then the investments can be customized, the models, all of that can be brought in and really have the flavor of your firm at this point in time. There's not many providers who don't have that type of flexibility. The kind of unique flexibility that we're seeing today is integrations with like rollover solutions, the ability to include outside assets, the ability to even customize the risk profile questionnaire that the participant will go through in order to determine what portfolio they're in. And we continue to see additional kind of ways to customize coming out. Now, there is obviously a balance to that when it comes to the fiduciary side. If you want to customize something, you could potentially pick up fiduciary risk that you're not necessarily expecting. But certainly a factor to work through, and if you can have more customization, more firm branding, and really make it your own, I think there is justification, and it is prudent. It's just really understanding. Back to the roles piece a minute ago. It really goes back to the roles and what is everyone doing, and really making sure that everyone is held to what they said they would do. So this slide here is a typical participant journey, and so I kind of broke it into QDIA and then opt-in. So when it's QDIA, obviously the participant doesn't have the ability to provide additional inputs from the start. Now, once they're enrolled, they certainly can sign in and provide all of those inputs. But if it's QDIA, they're typically taking around 5 factors. Usually it's like age, salary, current account balance. They'll take their sex, and sometimes they'll take location for tax purposes, and use that in order to provide customization. So still, you're getting some customization in a QDIA scenario. And then that is essentially just going to skip to the point where that data goes into the engine provides the allocation, and then the record keeper executes. So it kind of skips through a lot of this. However, if they choose to go engage after they're enrolled, or if it's an opt-in scenario where they have to opt into this service, they're going to typically access it through the record keeper website. And then the record keeper is going to provide the data that they have from the census, and really anything else in their system that's relevant to the managed account provider, usually the middleware. And then the participant can provide information through the UI and outside assets, risk tolerance, things like that. The engine takes all of these, provides them with a specific target allocation. Usually the participant has the choice to say, hey, you're off track, you're on track. Here's our recommendation. Do you accept or not? And then once they accept, the record keeper will execute the trade. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this, but this is a kind of high level, rule of thumb, 40,000 feet, if you will. And so let's move on and talk about fiduciary considerations, some of the common ones that come up, and just some concerns that participants, or excuse me, that plan sponsors and advisors and their home offices typically face. So there's a few that we'll discuss. So I mentioned the first one already, but fiduciary role. What is the role that this provider is playing? As I mentioned, it's usually a 338, but there's sometimes where they're providing non-discretionary advice, and in that instance, they would, obviously not be a fiduciary, they not be discretionary, and sometimes they're even just held out as education tools. Really not a true managed account, but an educational tool in which a participant can go through and mock up different scenarios. Sometimes they have managed account like names, and so that's just an important factor to understand is like what role are they playing, what is being outsourced, and what is the cost of that outsourcing and risk that we're shifting, right? The next one is advisor compensation, and I think this is an area that from my experience has given people a lot of pause, if you will, and there's a few different ways to structure the comp. Which may or may not lead to a conflict of interest. I think the most obvious one is, let's say you build the managed account and you add additional cost to it. Let's call it 10 basis points to the managed account cost. Well, now the advisor is getting paid an additional 10 basis points on all of the assets that go into the managed account. And so it just creates that conflict of, hey, the more people go in, the more the advisor gets paid, and really I think adds the level of compliance and documentation that you need in order to justify any recommendation of why someone should use it. This, going back to my product development days, this was something that I think gave a lot of people concern, and where we were going to land. And one other way to approach this is to structure it so you have, let's say a standard 338 and then a 338 plus, if you will. And that plus one includes the additional fiduciary services to the participant. And then there's a different cost between those. Let's say they charge 10 basis points more for the plus. Well, that eliminates that additional 10 bips that you would get from a participant. It's charged at the plan level, thus eliminating some of that conflict. So honestly, this piece can get really nuanced. We probably could do an hour on just compensation and structure and the conflicts that arise with it. But I just want to touch on it relatively quickly because it is something that can be very concerning, very confusing, and certainly an area that needs to be addressed and understood thoroughly if you're setting up a more personalized version of one of these. The next is cost. This is historically, in my opinion, what has led to the biggest hindrance on adoption of managed accounts. And, like to put some numbers out there, I've seen 40 basis points, I've seen 65 basis points just for the managed account fee. And so let's put it on like an expense ratio equivalent, right? Let's use the 40 basis points. That 40 basis points, then you got to add the fund cost to it. So let's call it 20, 30 basis points or so for the blended portfolio of an active and passive model, let's call it. 20 to 30. Now you're at what, 60 to 70 basis points. And very, very quickly you go above target dates in the cost. And I think that becomes really difficult for a fiduciary to justify. Now, I mentioned price compression, and what we see there is there's some services that I'm aware of that charge for the UI and technology and integration. Basically, all the managed account costs comes in somewhere around 5 to 10 basis points. Sometimes there's a record keeper fee on top of it that might get it to like 15 or even 20 basis points. But then you throw on that same 20 to 30 fund cost, and now you're somewhere around 30, 40. You're certainly sub 50 basis points to the participant. And that's where you really come into a price that is competitive with active target dates, passive and blend target dates. Pull up Google right now and search your favorite active target date. Pretty good chance that it's either that if you can get a managed account at like 35 basis points all into a participant, you're going to be very competitive with the target date. And that brings into question an interesting factor. So I'll touch on this in like 2 slides, but a GAO report questioned fees on managed accounts, and what they found, this is the Government Accountability Office. They found, and it's in their report that they put out, they found that the cost of managed accounts, while it was higher, the additional benefits most of the time actually offset the cost of it. So I thought that was a really, really interesting point. The other piece that I'd point out is the 2013 Department of Labor tips for fiduciaries on selecting target dates. And while it's specific to target dates, that was what was the prevalent QDIA at the time. I think that the guidance can still be applied to managed accounts and to personalized target dates. And what they say is to factor in specific demographic things like does the plan also offer a pension? What do participants do when they retire? Do they roll out? Do they keep it in the plan? Um, what other unique demographic aspects should be factored in? And they actually list a whole bunch of them out. They also talk about exploring um, like open architecture custom target dates, and they specifically reference how using multi-managers for the building blocks is a benefit and a prudent choice. And so this, when you factor when you relate it to managed accounts, they're in a lot of ways talking about things managed accounts do just in their standard off the shelf format. They do it better than a target date ever could. And so I think there is something to be said about that, and certainly some guidance from the DOL that would be supportive of a managed account that is at the same cost. And then the last one is suitability. Is there benefits to the participants? Considering the unique demographics of the plan. And I think a lot of times people will say, oh, well, it's the older workers that really benefit from this. There's actually some Morningstar research we'll talk about that conflicts with that, which I found actually quite interesting. I hadn't seen it before. And so let's close out with the participant outcomes. And this is going to be, I tried to be balanced on both the pros and the cons. It's not saying, hey, everyone should have a managed account. It's everyone should at least consider it and see if it makes sense for their participant base and their plan sponsor base. So we'll start out with the advantages and then go to disadvantages. And I do have, feel free to reach out and I can share the actual research pieces that these came from, but they're in the references slide. You can certainly look them up yourself if you choose. But we'll break it into a few different topics. So one is customized investment strategy. And this is the personalization, the fact that you get a portfolio that is tailored to you. And because it is tailored to you, there is some research that suggests that people are more engaged and have a lower lapse rate. So a lapse rate is defined, and this is from the Alight research that I referenced, but the lapse rate is defined as the percentage of people who leave a product. And, relative to target dates, you see a significantly lower lapse rate for managed accounts versus target dates at 67 versus 26%. That also shows higher returns versus self-directors. I don't think that's tremendously surprising. Full disclosure, the higher returns were versus self-directors, but you actually saw about the same, really slightly lower returns versus target dates, and just let that linger for a moment because we'll talk about that and why that piece is important. The other piece is higher savings rate. So Morningstar, in their impact and manage accounts on participant savings and investment decisions, they look at how participants are impacted when they enroll in a managed account. And what they found was about 80% of participants are off track, which they define as having a projected retirement income of less than 70% of your salary. When participants enrolled in the managed account, 72% of those that were previously off track increased their savings rate when they went into the managed account. If you think about it, that makes plenty of sense. You go through the UI process, you see, hey, I'm behind. I need to make some changes in order to improve my situation. And one of those changes is typically going to be suggested as increase your deferral rate, Others might be change your risk tolerance or reconsider your vision of retirement. But it's great to see, that they increased an average of 33% on the deferral, which is about 2% increase of their salary. So that's, I mean, really, really kind of impressive and in my opinion, a little unheard of, that type of salary increase. Usually you might see like a 0.5% or 1%. So 2%'s, I thought, really impressive. Now, remember that is engaged participants, not QDIA. So another key piece. It also provides better diversification. This is from the Alight study, but they talk about participants and how they're either underallocated or overallocated. I think it's interesting that younger workers are underallocated to equities. The older workers are overallocated to equities. Exactly the opposite of what you would expect. Um, there's some behavioral things I think you could get into from when those maybe generations were born and the experiences they've had, right? Millennials coming into the workplace and, the aftermath of '07, '08 and the great financial crisis and everything that we've seen since then. So I think there might be some behavioral aspects certainly at play there, but that's why having a managed account, a rational economic man, if you will, can help improve some of those bad behaviors. And then this one I thought was kind of interesting, just in general versus self-directors. Those that use managed accounts have more appropriate allocations to international U.S. large cap and bonds, and less in their company's stock, which is obviously a potentially big source of risk if your company goes under, your income disappears, and then a large portion of your retirement also can go away. So, somewhat concerning. The other thing I think that is important is the financial planning piece, and really it's understanding where you are along the way. Hey, I'm on track, I'm off track, and what do I need to do right now in order to improve my outcomes? Uh, and then fees, right? I put this under advantages because of that GAO report. But I think fees could honestly be in advantages and disadvantages. Honestly, I had it in disadvantages for quite a while. But I think it could be on both sides. But with the fee compression, I'm going to put it in the advantages side, because the GAO report does note that you typically see better outcomes versus versus self directors, and that the cost is outweighed by the benefit according to them. So moving on to disadvantages. So one is this is another big reason it hasn't taken off, in my opinion, is the complexity, and explaining that to participants, explaining it to plan sponsors, and honestly, from my experience, explaining it even to some of the people who work at the managed account manufacturers, struggle to explain it. The difference is what an advice engine does, what the middleware does. Once you get that understanding, all of a sudden you go to a different record keeper and it's all different. Or you, God forbid, you go to now a new managed account provider and everything is different. And so I think there needs to be better understanding and just simplification of the structure. And really that's one of the goals that I'm hoping to help with is provide simplified structure and pieces that will help to tell the difference between each from independent source, someone who's not a product manufacturer. Because quite honestly, most of the tools we've seen, look at all the target date tools in the last decade, but a lot of those have just been built by product manufacturers and are really like a sales tool. So the next is varied impact. This is important because this comes into deciding whether or not it even makes sense to add managed accounts to a plan or not, because you see huge differences in the impact and the outcomes for participants. And so the Morningstar report that I'm referencing here, they look at how managed accounts impacts different types of investors. And I pulled two out here. This is the barbell of the two. But basically, an off track, self director, do it yourself investor will experience a 47% increase in their average expected wealth from managed accounts because they're getting better, all the things we talked about on the advantages slide, right? Better, more customized allocation, more appropriate savings advice, and they're able to kind of change their behaviors and get back on track. However, those that have good behaviors already, right? The participants who are on track in a target date, right? They have an appropriate kind of asset allocation and diversification due to the target date, and they're on track, they're saving the right amount already. They saw no increase in average expected wealth from the managed account. And for honestly, for me, that was a kind of eye-opening statistic, right? And you dive into the numbers. And this is in the Alight piece and multiple Morningstar pieces. But if you look at like a 10-year return between target dates and managed accounts, you don't see a difference in performance. They pretty much track each other really closely over a lifetime. The pieces I've seen, they end up, and in fact, a lot of them actually show a target date having slightly better return, like 0.1%, so pretty minimal, but a slightly better return than the managed account. And so it really brings into question like what is the where does a managed account fit if the investment piece and if it's used as a QDIA, you're really not seeing the benefit from a personalization standpoint or any of that. It really comes down I think to participant engagement. And if you have engagement, as you see with the off-track DIY investor, they are going to make changes in their behaviors, which are going to over time drive the right outcomes. And there's another piece that Morningstar put out that's interesting. And I think historically we all think managed accounts make the most sense for an older worker with a larger balance and all of that. But because of the additional cost, Morningstar looks at what is the difference in savings rate that you would need to experience from going into the managed account to basically offset the cost. And because younger workers have time value of money on their side, they're usually saving less, a small increase. And the other aspect is the managed account cost is usually AUM based. And so a smaller balance, they're going to charge less, a larger balance, they're going to charge more. In order to offset that, they find that it's actually the younger, lower balance workers that have the most benefit from going into a managed account versus the older, higher balance workers because they need such an increase in their savings rate or their investment outcomes, which the research doesn't show is there, that they need such a big increase in their kind of behaviors and their savings rate in order to realize the benefits and the increased costs. So it gets honestly really nuanced when you're looking at the participant base and making the decision whether to add it or not. The other, and I'll hit these last three pretty quickly, but benchmarking and performance comparisons. It's pretty easy to plug a large growth fund in or a target date fund into FI360 or RPAG or Morningstar, and you can analyze them. Like there's similarities. There's plenty of courses and designations that teach you to do that. There really isn't so much when it comes to these personalized solutions, personalized target dates, and managed accounts, and the variation between them. Just we've tried to keep things very simple today, but the variation when you really get into the nitty gritty, and the ability to customize can make it more difficult. So let's take, for instance, that you want to customize the strategic asset allocations. Well, there's a piece that now there's some liability, there's some kind of change in the off-the-shelf structure. So with that, you got to factor in how much risk are you taking? Are you comfortable with it? And how are you controlling and balancing that risk? And I think of it too, like there's challenges in benchmarking and doing performance attribution for multi-asset class funds, target dates, balance funds, for instance. But that becomes exponentially more difficult when you add the managed account to to the equation, right? You still have the strategic allocations and the funds that are actually used to build it that come into account. And there's even different parties that are selecting those. But then you factor in the dynamic moves from the portfolio. And then if that solution has really advanced engagement or has no engagement, how do you factor that in? Because really engagement is where you see the biggest benefit coming from the managed account is if you can get people to take action, understand their situation, and make those right behavioral changes. All of that needs to be factored in. One suggestion, one potential idea to approach this is to view it as a essentially like what is your percentage to goal, and having a consistent similar number that you can say, hey, a participant using a target date would be this distance to goal, this percentage to goal based on these factors. And perhaps you create a set of personas that you use to track this and have their behaviors and that person all lined up, see what they would do in a target date. And then the flip side, you can request that information from managed account providers and they can run back testing for you. And that can be one way to have a similar number. And really that's ultimately what we're trying to get to, is how do you drive better outcomes. Privacy is a concern, right? Like everyone's pretty familiar with all the hacks and leaks and everything going on. This is very sensitive information that's used to build these recommendations, and so there's an enhanced level of privacy and concern I think people have on sharing their spousal assets and things like that. And we talked about this earlier a little bit, but the conflicts of interest that exist, and we talked about conflicts in relation to advisor compensation, but a few others that exist is cross-selling of other product, whether it be that managed account provider's rollover solution. Maybe they have like an insurance exchange that they try to get people into. There's a few different things out there. The other big one that I think doesn't necessarily get enough attention is the managed account solutions that are put out by a mutual fund company, right? A DCIO provider. And with those, most of the time they offer their managed account, and then they're going to offer typically like a pricing discount to use their funds, which that's fine, right? The pricing discount makes a ton of sense. They don't want to bill on the same assets twice. And but the challenge I think with that is that they're essentially bribing and incentivizing you to use a fund from that fund family, which may create the conflict that, hey, you're choosing to use perhaps a fund that's not as good as another fund in order to get that pricing discount. And so those are all things that need to be factored and balanced as you're working through the setup of each of these solutions. And I won't belabor the advisor compensation point, but that one is certainly can get messy. And so I recommend keeping it simple as possible on that front. These are the references, all the research that I kind of spoken about in the last page or two. If you'd like to go read it yourself, there's actually some really interesting ones in here. And then just kind of closing out. So uh, my take when I went into this research and this paper was that there was certainly a benefit from a QDIA managed account, and that participants could experience better outcomes just from that. But when you go into the research, and even other research that I've seen kind of not published, that just doesn't hold true from anything that I've seen. And I think that's where you got to look to manage accounts to what they do that a target date can't do. And one, for those who have complex situations, makes sense. um, Solutions that have and offer better participant engagement, and even other ways you can find ways to better engage with the participants. One that I've seen recently was a text messaging based engagement from a company called Moneywell, and I think I look at my email, my personal email, and there's thousands of things in there. Like email's a terrible way to get people's attention. Um, but text messages, you see almost every text message. So I think that's a really unique spin on things. But really, how do we drive better engagement, get participants more involved? The other area I think this makes sense for, and I've gotten pushback on this from others, is for advisors who do wealth management business. This is the best way, in my opinion, to uncover rollover and other wealth management opportunities. And I say that because if you sit down with a participant and you say, "Tell me about your situation, your outside assets, your spousal assets, and I'm going to help you determine which target date to go into." I think people can see right through that and realize that that's a self-serving discussion for the advisor. However, if there's a benefit, the with them, what's in it for me, there is a benefit to providing that additional information for the participant within a managed account context because they're able to get better, more accurate advice. And it's not necessarily a question out of the blue. It's a question that's very relevant for the discussion that advisor's having. So I think it's a tremendous way to uncover outside opportunities. And even some of the middlewares have features that allow you to see the outside assets that a participant has offered up through some of their tool. And with that, I'll leave you with kind of just this thought is that managed accounts and personalized target dates I think can add a lot of value. I think that they need to be properly analyzed, properly compared, and make sure that the cost is uh, relevant to the services and value that you're providing. I think that you'll see a huge increase in adoption if retirement income solutions take off, and as some of these at work solutions and this more holistic approach to participants, this intersection of wealth and retirement, as they call it. I think you'll see that kind of drive the further adoption of managed accounts. Um, so with that, this is my contact info. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. If you want any of the research, if you'd like a copy of the deck, feel free to shoot me an email and I can send it over to you. With that, I appreciate everyone's time. Have a great rest of your week and thank you for attending.